Good morning. Welcome to UUCC, the UU Church of Canandaigua, and happy Easter. I'm Eileen, I'm your minister. I'm so glad to be gathered with you this morning. Before we begin our worship service, I have a few quick announcements I'd like to share with you. The first is that hopefully you all received a little care package of Easter goodies and some instructions about what you might do with those. So if you got bubbles, have your bubbles nearby, but hold on to them for a minute. We're not ready for bubbles yet. Just have them nearby. If you decorated or didn't decorate a wooden egg and hid it in the background, or could just run off and hide it in the background with your video off right now, that is great. We're going to hang out in this room for a little bit when the service is over and do a virtual egg hunt. So my friends who are ready to search their screens for a gallery of eggs, you can be peeking during the service. I won't know. No one will know. It's fine. And let me share my screen. We have a couple of other announcements for you this morning. The first is that our Common Read book group is going to meet on the 6th, just a couple of days. So this is your last chance to sign up. You'll find a link for sign up in the chat here in worship or in your newsletter if you receive our newsletter. This is a book by Imani Perry, Breathe. It's called A Letter to My Sons, a work on anti-racism in the form of a letter to Perry's sons. And Lynn Overgaard is going to facilitate this group. It should be a good discussion. So if you're interested, you can sign up today. And then we are hoping, we are praying, we are believing that we will be together in our building again someday. Someday not too far off. And when that happens, we're going to need some worship volunteers. And we need some folks to volunteer to do some of these jobs you see here on the screen, to be ushers and greeters, to be worship associates, to be tech helpers, to run the live stream of worship we're going to keep doing, because some folks won't be safe to come to church all the time or right away. And we'll need lay preachers, as always. And all these jobs might look a little different or feel a little different than they were a year ago. So even if you used to do one of these jobs and you want to keep doing them, that's great. We can go over what the new role might look like. If you've never tried one of these before, but you think maybe it's time to give it a shot, we can go over what the role will look like. So if you're interested in helping with in-person worship in any of these ways, let me know, and we'll have everything set up for that beautiful day when we do get to be together physically. And with that, let's take a deep breath in and let us enter a space of worship together. Let's light our chalices together. So if you have a chalice at home or any old candle, let's light them now as we recite our chalice lighting words. We kindle this. Why am I blanking on our chalice lighting words? Bill, can you help me out?
We gather this hour.
We gather this hour. We kindle this flame. Where was I going? Too many chocolate bunnies. We gather this hour as a people of faith with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning in celebration of the life we share together. This is why we don't go it alone. So I want to tell you a story that I told you the first time that I preached for you at UUCC. It's still true. And I harbor no delusions about how many of you are listening to me on bated breath at any given moment. So I think it's safe to tell it again. I moved into my first house in Rochester in 2010. And I've kept a garden everywhere I've lived, so this place was no exception. It was in the middle of the city, but it had a little postage stamp of a backyard, just big enough for a small kitchen garden. When I planned my garden that year, I thought about putting in some asparagus. Asparagus, as you may know, is a perennial. It keeps coming back every year, but it takes about 3 years of growth before it's mature enough to harvest anything. I was fairly certain I wouldn't be in that house for more than 3 years, so I didn't plant any. Well, life is full of twists and turns, and I ended up staying in that home for more than 7 years. My now husband moved in with me. We adopted 3 dogs in that house. We had a baby there. And every one of those 7 springs, after more weeks of brutally cold, snowy winter than any human should reasonably endure, tiny signs of life would start emerging. Snow would melt, birds would appear, the hardiest of plants would poke their little bodies up out of the still solid ground. We humans would grasp onto each and every promise of the warm days to come, and I would dream about asparagus. I could have done more than dream. I could have enjoyed years of fresh asparagus, that first promise of spring, holding all the hope of a verdant tomorrow in its every stalk, if I'd only had the generosity of spirit to plant it for somebody else. I made a decision to plant asparagus on every future patch of earth that I got to call mine. I did that in our house in Albany, even though I knew we were moving before even the next harvest season. I knew I'd never taste it, but I have hope that someone is today. Maybe generations of someone's will. Tiny spears are just now peeking their heads above the cold soil here in Rochester. Now, maybe you think asparagus is gross. That's fine. You can still be the kind of person who plants asparagus, someone who plants hope for a future that you yourself might never see. We can be people who think generationally about our choices, people who, in spite of having nothing to gain, plant our hope in the world. I promised to plant asparagus, figuratively, here with you, no matter how long I'm with you. And that's why we all come to church, I think, to learn to be the person who plants when she might just leave it for someone else. To have a place that calls us to send out roots to be watered, even long after we're gone. And so this morning, as we prepare for our first hymn, I want to share with you that this first hymn is a compilation, a virtual chorus, the work of 25 singers from 7 upstate congregations, organized by Tom Snell at First Unitarian in Rochester, and includes a few of our own UUCC singers. So I invite you to sing along or to simply let the music wash over you this morning. And now it's time for a story. This is the story of Easter, adapted from the book by a person we call Mark. Jesus was dead upon the cross. As the sun sank low in the sky, a small group of women, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, watched as Jesus's body was wrapped in a linen cloth and taken to a tomb cut in the rock of a nearby olive grove. What about the proper burial traditions? They asked anxiously, for they wanted to care for the body of their friend and teacher. They will have to wait, answered Joseph of Arimathea grimly. Our Sabbath day of rest is beginning. Stand back and let us roll the stone door in place. They pushed the round stone along the groove in the rock that guided it firmly over the entrance of the cave. When the Sabbath was over, the women brought spices so that they could go and anoint Jesus's body. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the heavy stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, but they were alarmed. He said to them, "Do not be afraid. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter that he has gone ahead of you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that is the end of our first story. And now, my friends, is our time to share our joys and sorrows with one another. We are a community that holds one another in our celebrations and in our pain. And I'd like to invite you this morning to use the chat to share what it is that lies on your heart, all those deep feelings of your heart, whatever they may be. And to know as you share that whatever you're feeling, we are with you. Are there joys or sorrows to lift up this morning? Our hearts are full this morning, holding gratitude for our UUCC singers in the chorus, concern and prayer for Megan's cousin, joy at family bonding, and celebration for a new baby in the Chilson Plant family. We lift up both joy and sorrow for Carrie's mom, and pain at the loss of the family dog in the McGrath family. We are joyful at the return of spring and share concern for Joan's grandson and his family, celebrating Gretchen's upcoming wedding, and holding Carrie in her worries for her friend. We hold mixed feelings about the end of hockey season and feeling such joy for returns to normalcy bit by bit, and for the support and love and care of this community. For these and all those joys and sorrows we hold silently in our hearts, we are with one another. And now I want to invite you into the spiritual practice of generosity. This is a community funded by your generosity. Your donations support the good work that we do here at UUCC. And our wider community is also funded by the generosity of our good people. And so every month we share a quarter of our Sunday plate offerings with a local partner, a service partner who shares our values. This month in April, we share a quarter of our offering with Sunrise Movement, the Rochester chapter. Sunrise is a youth movement to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. They are building an army of young people to make climate change an urgent priority across America, ending the corrupting influence of fossil fuel executives on our politics, and electing leaders who stand up for the health and well-being of all people. You can give to this morning's offering by visiting our website at canandaiguauu.org/connection/donate. There's a link in the chat now, or by mailing a check to UUCC at 3024 Cooley Road in Canandaigua, or by setting up an automatic recurring gift through your bank. In any of those cases, if you make a note that your offering is intended for this morning's collection, then we will be sure to share a quarter of it with our partner. We thank you for your generosity today. And now it is time for another story. This is another story you may know. It is the story of Exodus, part of the story of Passover. And it goes like this. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Take your flocks and herds as you have said and go and praise your God." The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot. There were about 600,000 people on foot. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough the Israelites brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast, because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. When Pharaoh let the people go, their God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that way was shorter. God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. When Pharaoh was told that the people had fled, he and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We've let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took an army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, and with officers, all of them. The Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to God. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done bringing us out of Egypt? It would have been better to stay there and die." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance your God will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." Then God said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch your hand over the sea. Divide the water so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will gain the glory through Pharaoh and all his army, his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, and when I gain glory through the Pharaoh." Then Moses stretched his hand over the sea, and all that night the God of the Israelites drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and a mixed crowd went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. And that is the end of our story. I invite you now into a time of centering and meditation, followed by shared silence. Get comfortable in your seat. Take a deep breath and maybe let it out with a sigh. You can allow your eyes to fall closed if that feels right to you. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears And some piece of you find the earth beneath you or something solid to support you. By the waters of Babylon, a long ago poet wrote, we sat down and wept, and we remembered Zion. How can we sing our old songs in a new land? And somehow, out of the swirling waters of the deep, the world is born. From the lightless void of space, bang, a whole universe. Enclosed in a shadowy womb, we become. Beneath the dank, wet earth, hope is getting ready to emerge. And in the dark of an empty tomb, something is stirring. Precisely when we find ourselves wailing at the river, wandering in the wilderness, weeping in the dark, we are being born. Born and reborn, and only in the shadows of the empty spaces can we create a prayer, a song, a new world.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart, all the servants of the land. Oh, the wind, rise in the sea. In the land, healing life, shade of justice, roots only love, wings that we free, Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
So you probably had heard or had some knowledge of both those stories that we told this morning already. These are familiar narratives in our culture. They get told and retold and acted out over and over again. In the excerpt of the Passover story, Moses leads the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. And when they come to the obstacle of the Red Sea, he lifts his staff, the sea splits in two, and the people cross over into a whole lifetime of wandering in the wilderness. In the story from Mark, the first version of the Easter story we have, the oldest version we have, Jesus dies, and 3 days later, his friends find an empty tomb and a whole lot of unanswered questions. Mark's account is a little more mysterious than the later Gospels. There's no resurrected Jesus, at least not in any certain way. His friends don't meet him on the road later and get to spend 40 more days with him, like we see in later stories. The tone of the whole book rushes toward his death, and then that's it. Empty tomb. No answers. No promises of new life, just the pale hope that lies in the dark abyss of mystery. I will admit it's my favorite gospel account, and exactly because it doesn't hand us hope on a silver platter. There's no hallelujahs except the ones we carve ourselves out of the darkness of that empty tomb. The writer we call Mark, whatever his real name was, we do not know, wrote this account sometime after 70 CE, which we know because they reference the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. So some 50 years or so after the events it chronicles. And the Jewish communities of Israel, including Jesus's surviving followers and their followers, were reeling from that attack by the power of Rome on Jewish sovereignty and identity. They felt like, and they wrote like, the world was ending. They didn't know how to go on without all that they had known, without a roadmap for the future, without any promise of liberation. And so we get this book, this gospel, where Jesus's actions, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, uplifting the powerless, were all subtle subversions of the power of empire. That empire that claimed to spread a pax romana, but actually spread sickness, hunger, and powerlessness. We get no promises of some bright tomorrow, but the pale hope for liberation that can only be found in the dark. And the story of Passover, the story we have in the book of Exodus in Jewish scriptures, sets this tale at an unclear point in time. But there's not a shred of archaeological evidence or historical record that a massive group of people escaped slavery in Egypt at any point in time. And empires keep very good records, but no Egyptian ever made mention of it. It was written, as far as we know, in the 6th century BCE. You see, back in the 580s, Jerusalem was invaded by the great empire of Babylon. That's present-day Iraq. And the power of that empire that had previously controlled, the power of the empire that had previously controlled that part of the world, Egypt, was waning. And Babylon took control of the region. The Babylonian army conquered the city of Jerusalem, pillaged the first temple, and took some 10,000 Jewish prisoners back to Babylon to be held in captivity. Those enslaved people had mostly been priests, scribes, students of law, members of the king's court, and lucky us, they were literate. These are the people who wrote the Jewish Bible. And all the evidence we have says they wrote it while they were enslaved in Babylon. Formerly the keepers of a ritual culture that centered on the temple rites at that first Jewish temple in Jerusalem, these people struggled to find a way to make meaning in their world in the midst of trauma. They tried to preserve their old stories, their rules for living, and to formulate a new way of being religious in the middle of a crisis without a clear roadmap, without any promises of liberation. They ended up creating these texts filled with their pain and confusion about how to live and how to make meaning, and a subtle but constant subversiveness to the authority of empire. A subversiveness that runs like a pale thread of hope that can be found in the dark. Once upon a time, they wrote for their fellow captives and captors alike to hear, we were the slaves of an evil empire, like we are now. But divine power was on our side then, and divine power favors justice over empire, and we were liberated. Not into the promised land, but to spend a generation in a desert, fed by a pale hope of tomorrow for our children's children. The underlying message being, it could happen again. These stories are powerful because they're not histories of people who used to be in crisis, in sorrow, in need of liberation. They're stories of hope for people who are now in need of liberation. They are for the Israelites in Babylon, not Egypt. For friends of Jesus who lost their leader and saw their temple demolished. For enslaved people and abolitionists who lived in this country. For people today calling for the abolition of police who execute with impunity. For trans children in Arkansas whose lives are subject to debate in the legislature. For undocumented people who cannot find safe haven in their schools or workplaces or homes. For all of those who are thrown to the margins by the expansive power of empire. It is an ancient story told many times before, and it is the story of this moment. We stand at the water's edge of liberation, and there are no promises. We see no promised land, and we might never see it, but still we step out. We send ripples ahead. We imagine dry ground. Still we plant for tomorrow, even with only a pale hope of new life to come, even though we may never taste the fruits of our planting. May it be so. And I invite you for this next piece of music to put your screen into gallery view. You have an option probably in the top left of your Zoom app. And to blow your bubbles as we listen.
If my words did glow with the gold of sunshine, my tunes were played on the harp unstrung, would you hear my voice come through the music? Would you hold it near as it were your own? It's a hand-me-down. The thoughts are broken, perhaps they're better left unsung. I don't know, don't really care. Let there be songs to fill the air, ripple in still water when there is no pebble toss, no wind to blow. Reach out your hand. If your cup be empty, if your cup is full, may it be again. Let it be known there is a fountain that was not made by the hands of men. There is a road, no simple highway between the dawn and the dark of night. And if you go, no one may follow. That path is for your steps alone. Ripple in still water when there is no pebble toss, no wind to blow. You choose to lead, must follow. But if you fall alone. If you should stand
On this day in 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. And so I invite you to take in these words of his just a few days before his death as a benediction for us today. "I've seen the promised land," he said. "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know that we as a people will get to the promised land." May it be so. Let's sing together our closing hymn, "Lo, the earth awakes today." Let's extinguish our chalices together. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.